welcome to Jakpost Upclose. This is actually our 8th webinar, and I will be your MC for today. Our topic for this session is multilateralism during pandemic in Indonesia's perspective. Now, in 2020, I think there is one thing that we are realizing right now is that we have been taking for granted the ability to have this unlimited opportunity to have meeting and interaction with people in real life settings. And for our diplomats, I think some of those real life setting is happening in international forums like the United Nations, ASEAN, G20s, and many others. And I think we just see that this coronavirus pandemic and the social distancing regulation have forced diplomats to limit travel and face-to-face interaction. And I can only imagine how hard everything has become because of this limitation. So, and also at the same time, the challenges have just multiplied, I think, because in the past few months, we have seen the foreign ministry has tackled so many issues from the beginning of the pandemic. Like in the beginning, we have seen how the foreign ministry has tackled various issues related to how to ensure the safety and security of Indonesians living abroad, and somehow how to repatriate them in various situations, various difficult situations. And as things develop, we also see how Indonesia have to secure the supply of medical equipment, medicines, and also to make cooperation to develop vaccines. And now, as we just learned about the economic growth that has been reduced to 5%, we also have to figure out how to jumpstart the economy. I think we can all agree that this is will be the most challenging period in our history. Now, at the same time, we also facing this challenge that the rules-based international order and multilateral system has come under increasing pressure, and because it has led every country for themselves. So I think I believe that the increased rivalry between superpowers has only worsened the situation. This led us to question what is Indonesia's position. Indonesia has said that there is a need to maintain multilateral system that puts forward collective interest and prevent the mighty from taking all. Now, this is actually a quote I took from Ibu Retno-Marsudi, our foreign minister. So we are very honored today to have Ibu Retno with us to share how Indonesia is overcoming the many challenges that I've mentioned before. Welcome, Bu Retno. Welcome. Now, so before we start, I would like to explain the agenda for our webinar today. So we will begin today's webinar with a talk show with Ibu Retno and our Deputy Editor-in-Chief, Mas Taufiq Rahman. This will be a 45 to 60-minute session. After that, we will have a breakout session followed by a panel discussion with 4 distinguished speakers to enrich our discussion. The Jakarta Post editor, Tama Salim, will be moderating this session, and speakers will give talks and presentation. So we encourage everyone to submit your question in your Q&A box, and we will read it later. So yeah. So once again, I thank you for participating in our webinar. If you want the Jakarta Post to contribute more to public discourse, please subscribe today on the Jakarta Post packages, and I will share you the link as in the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ibu Retno and Mas Taufiq for the talk show session. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dian, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is our 8th installment of the webinar series. And I think today we're going to talk about very important questions about the state of international relation. And I think it is safe to say that despite the easing of lockdown in some places, I think most of you are now still at home, thanks to COVID-19. I know that you now probably feel that the last 6 months feel like 6 years, if not longer. But in the Jakarta Post, we are determined to make your time at home more valuable. And I think most of us now joining this seminar, either from home, probably except for Bu Retno, at home or at their home countries. So this is very interesting time. This pandemic has definitely changed our lives, and it has ushered in a profound change in international politics. I think the most obvious now that the territorial borders has make a comeback with a vengeance, with the lockdown and quarantine rules, and also the race for vaccine remind us of sort of the arm race of the past, and the scramble over drugs and medicine has also contributed to the rise in tension. And I think to make sense of the change, I think this is very appropriate that with us today, we have Ibu Retno-LP-Marsudi, the Indonesian Foreign Minister. Thank you, Bu Retno, for taking the time to join us between your busy Zoom schedules.
Thank you very much, Pa Taufiq, and thank you very much for having me. And once again, hi to everybody. Good afternoon, and I do hope that you are all well.
Thank you, Bu Retno. We hope everything is also great at your end. And without further ado, I would like to ask the most pertinent questions. I think this is relevant to all of us. With all the things that Dian and I have summarized, how would you characterize the world after COVID or during COVID? Do you spot any trends that we should keep an eye on, that we should closely watch right now?
Well, thank you very much for that very valid question. But Dian, by the way, you take all my words, Dian, so I don't know what should I explain again, because you cover almost everything, Dian. Well, back to your question, Pa Taufiq, about the what will be the trend? How do we see the situation right now? The first thing that I have to mention here is, of course, the situation is very unprecedented. So means that with the unprecedented challenges, we need the unprecedented response. And in the beginning of the pandemic, unfortunately, we also observe that country, they tend to close their door to foreigners, to other nationals, which is, it's very well understood. But hopefully, this kind of attitude is very temporary. In the long run, what I want to see remains the cooperation among countries, because I do not believe that any country can live by their own. So what I see is that first, trust in global governance weakened. The pandemic exposed limited capabilities of international institution and organization. So what does it mean? It means that adjustment of global governance are needed. We have to adjust everything and come up with the new things for post-COVID-19. The second point that I observe is that trust to multilateralism is in decline. So by the way, you have a very good title, Multilateralism During a Pandemic. So I observe that trust to multilateralism is in decline. And what I see is that the right-wing politics and populism becomes more popular. And we also see that transactional politics will increasingly become a new norm. At the other side, we also see that what I call is that the self-help mechanism is increasing. So the self-reliance effort will become more obvious. Every country, everybody wants to develop a stronger self-reliance. That's including, of course, Indonesia. And even now, we really believe with the saying, don't put all eggs in one basket. Because when you put all your eggs in one basket and if something happened with that basket, then everything will be in chaos. And then unfortunately, we see also that rivalries between or among major powers continues. And this creates many uncertainties. So at least there are some major elements that I see emerge from the situation right now and the situation post-COVID-19, Mas Taufiq.
Okay, and probably I just want a little bit of follow-up on that. So do you think that the COVID-19 condition sort of worsening the pre-existing condition, but this is a bit speculative, but do you foresee that this is going to be lasting for a while, or that, okay, once the crisis is over, you're going to see more of a cooperation?
I hope that this will be temporarily. So that's why in any meeting, in every meeting that I have, I always mention about the need for us to stay together, to be united in fighting the pandemic, because I do believe that we can live by our own. So hopefully that is the feeling of all. So while we are trying to settle the situation, especially domestically speaking, at the same time, we try to get back to build a stronger cooperation among us.
Yeah, you also mentioned about that. I think this is not really the best time to have sort of a great power rivalries, but here we are. We have the US and China. I mean, even without COVID, this is already a big, massive problem. But now we have them having these old style rivalries amidst a pandemic. What do you think the impacts of that great power rivalries to us, especially in the region, Retno?
Yeah, well, to be very honest to you, Pak Taufiq, relation between great powers have not always been cordial, even before the pandemic. But it becomes more challenging during the pandemics. Even, for example, we know all that the issue of the origin of the virus itself continues to become an issue, even impacting the WHO. And the blaming games happens. So rivalries continue to expand into more dimension. Of course, it is not conducive at a time when global solidarity and cooperation are imperative. Again, the keyword here is solidarity and cooperation. And then the bad thing is its potential, I mean, the rivalries has the potential to force other countries to take side. And some analysts said that a new Cold War is in the making. And there are some principles, a number of principles that will guide diplomacy, Indonesian diplomacy in responding to rivalries between or among great powers. First, this is very important, that Indonesia will remain steadfast in its free and active foreign policy, politik luar negeri bebas aktif. All great powers are important and strategic partner for Indonesia, because even when I talk to China and the US, I always mention that both of you are important partners for Indonesia. And Indonesia will not allow, or we will not allow ourselves to be forced to take sides. So our national interest will determine the course of our foreign policy and not the external influence. That is the first one. The second one, Indonesia will consistently urge all parties to refrain themselves from provocative rhetoric and action, intensify dialogue, and peacefully settle their differences. It sounds very cliche, but this message, I continue to convey this message to them, to our partners. I mean, the last time I had a bilateral talk with, I think last week I had a bilateral talk with the Chinese foreign minister, and then this week I received a phone call from Secretary Pompeo. So we try to maintain our communication with them. And during the communication, I also mentioned about the Southeast Asia. I mentioned that Southeast Asia must remain a region of peace, freedom, and neutrality. And I convey this to my ASEAN foreign minister colleagues in line with the spirit of ZOPFAN declaration. Because ASEAN, we have the declaration of ZOPFAN. So this is the platform. And then we just make use of the principle of ZOPFAN and implement it. And then I also mentioned to my ASEAN colleagues that our neighbors and partners must continue to uphold the principle enshrined in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, TEC. And then the third, Indonesia will continue promoting ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific to ensure the regional dynamics to contribute to the regional peace, security, and prosperity. And this is especially important as we are recovering from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. So this is what I see from the rivalries and between or among major powers, and how Indonesia react or respond to this trend of increasing rivalries between them.
Okay, so you believe that politik bebas aktif is still relevant, if not more relevant, during the COVID, I think.
Yeah. That's true.
Okay, so you also have mentioned about multilateralism, and I think we've seen even in European Union now, they're strengthening their borders. So this is sort of the, I don't want to say the unraveling of multilateralism, but it certainly have weakened. And what is your view on that? And what are the steps that we can take or ASEAN can contribute to rebuild sort of trust in multilateralism, which is under assault right now?
When you talk about multilateralism, we are also talking about managing the expectation. Because before the pandemic, we do believe that multilateralism, we take for granted that multilateralism will work well and it will bring benefit to everybody. But it seems that the situation doesn't reflect exactly what we usually mention. So weakening trust in multilateralism is one of the global trends that we observe in the post-COVID-19 world. We cannot deny that multilateral institutions are increasingly struggling to respond to ever complex global challenges, that's including this pandemic. And at the same time, countries increasingly have higher expectation. Again, this is about managing expectation on this multilateral institution to deliver concrete and immediate result. So I think it is not an exaggeration to say that this pandemic is a test to multilateralism. So the key message that I would like to convey is that, of course, Indonesia continues to believe in the virtue of multilateralism, in finding solutions, harness resources, and coordinate response to many global challenges. I recall back in April, Indonesia co-initiated the UNGA resolution on global solidarity to fight against COVID-19, which underlined the central role of the UN system in fighting COVID-19. So Indonesia was one of the co-sponsors. So we cannot allow weakening trust in multilateralism to persist, because that is just Dian just mentioned in the opening. Without multilateralism, the might takes all will prevail, and smaller countries stand to lose more. And two ways to rebuild our trust. You are talking about trust, how to rebuild trust in multilateralism. At least two ways. One, we must ensure that multilateralism continues to deliver during the time of crisis. Because again, the test is actually during the crisis. People want to see how the UN and international financial institutions contribute to the acceleration of socio-economic recovery due to COVID-19. And then second, we must ensure the UN and global governance, I'm talking about global governance, are always fit for the purpose against new challenges. So the UN and the global governance are not perfect. Everybody knows they are not perfect, but it is up to us, the members, responsible members of the international community, to strengthen them, because if not us, then who else? And this year, Pak Taufiq, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN, and I think it should provide us a momentum to push for a reform. And developing countries must have a say in this reform.
Okay, so you basically want that the existing institution it's not perfect, but you want to strengthen and reform that institution. Yeah. So I want to now shift towards a more day-to-day affair of the ministry, or what would the view of Indonesia in this pandemic. And we now face a multitude of challenges. We have the economic problem, we have problems securing vaccines, medication, for instance. So there's a lot of competing priorities. So what in your opinion, what are some of the main priorities that Indonesian foreign policies is facing during this pandemic, Retno?
Well, talking priorities, of course, I think during my statement, January, every January, I always mention about the priority of the foreign policy for the next 5 years. I call it the 4+1. This 4+1 remains very relevant, but we are now facing the pandemic. And there is no other option for us to adjust the priorities of our foreign policy. So on top of the 4+1 priorities, which I believe many of you are already familiar with, there are 3 immediate priorities for the Indonesian foreign policy during a pandemic. First is the protection of Indonesian citizens abroad. Dian also mentioned about it in her introduction. And this includes ensuring those who are infected receive appropriate care, and then facilitating their voluntary return to Indonesia. It is not an easy exercise, and I started to evacuate our Indonesian national from Wuhan since January. So before the pandemic, before the first positive case found in Indonesia, I started to evacuate our national from Wuhan in January. And of course, facilitating the distribution of the sembako. Sembako is the basic need, and other care packages to those who are severely impacted by pandemic. So take care who are positive, and then we repatriate or evacuate, and then we distribute also the sembako. So let me give you a glimpse of what we are doing. As per today is the 6th of August, right? So yesterday was the 5th of August. So as of the 5th of August, we have facilitated the return of more than 138,000 Indonesian. And then the distribution of more the distribution of sembako and the basic need, it is more than 528,000 sembako and care packages. Can you imagine, Pak Taufiq? We distributed more than 500,000 packages amidst all the lockdown. I remember very much because most of this sembako were distributed in Malaysia, and at that time Malaysia were in the MCO, something like lockdown, and sometimes to reach our national, it took us to drive 2, 3, 4 hours from Kuala Lumpur. So I think Indonesia is one of the few countries that distribute care packages and sembako to its citizens abroad in massive scale. So one is the protection of our national. And then the second one is filling the shortages of medicine and medical supplies, as well as supporting the development of COVID vaccine. So medical supplies, medicine, and vaccine. Dian mentioned some of it. During the first few months of the pandemic, medical supplies were in shortages because many countries limited their export. And we have to think creatively to procure them, including through joint production with other countries. And one moment that I will never forget is to negotiate with South Korea, with the Republic of Korea, on the provision of our PPEs. And in fact, that was the first large number of PPEs that we can get during the pandemic. That was 110,000 from South Korea. And it took me, I think, about 2 or 3 days negotiation. And now, I mean, because of the pandemic, and then it creates also innovation. We think fast, and at the end, we see that it brings benefit also for us. Now, Indonesia has the capacity to produce internationally certified protective gears in line with the WHO standard. Because we thought the pandemic, maybe we are not there yet, but now we have the capacity, certified internationally standard for the protective gears, and we are ready even to export them. And we also facilitate the international cooperation for Indonesia, and last week we just witnessed a symbolic handover of, for example, 100 ventilators from the US, a total of from 1,000 ventilators will be delivered to Indonesia throughout this month. And then vaccine. Vaccine is very important. Vaccine will be the game changer. And our diplomacy work for vaccine since the very beginning of the pandemic, and we take 2 parallel tracks. One is short-term. Short-term, we are talking about the access to vaccine. So facilitating the international collaboration. And Indonesia is now working with many countries as an equal partner. And we are the biggest, don't forget that we are the biggest vaccine producer in Southeast Asia. And then we have to talk about the long term, the self-reliance in producing vaccine for COVID-19. So we are also supporting our national consortium effort, which involve many domestic stakeholders. The aim is to produce our own vaccine. And then the third priority is about the economic recovery. It's very challenging, but our diplomacy, our foreign policy has to work to support the economic recovery. And this is very daunting task for all diplomats right now. Sorry, it's a bit long.
Okay, no problem, Bu Retno. You early on you mentioned about the trip to Malaysia. You mentioned the trip to Wuhan, and I think this must be very challenging for our diplomats with all the travel restriction. How does this pandemic, and especially the travel restriction, has affected, the diplomatic machinery? And if we can learn from this, how do you think that we can do better in the future, or the qualities that our diplomats, for instance, can assume when they conduct their work after the pandemic? Do you think any significant learning that we can have from this pandemic?
We learned a lot from this pandemic, but every time I have a communication with my colleagues, the foreign minister, most of the time we start with asking each other or by posing a question: when was your last trip abroad? Because foreign policy always foreign minister always traveling, right? But all of a sudden we are all stuck. And I said that, well, my last travel was in February, so March, April, May, June, July, August, 6 months already.
Okay.
Stuck here. And as I mentioned to you, we learned a lot from this pandemic. First of all, due to the pandemic, we are no longer confined to traditional diplomacy, such as physical meetings and direct negotiation. Many of what we did during this pandemic have gone beyond our core traditional business, beyond business as usual. I mean, beyond core traditional business is like what I mentioned to you about the vaccine and others. Now I have a number of diplomats, young diplomats, who knows every details of medicine and vaccine. We never think it before. A diplomat knows everything about medicine and vaccine. And more than ever before, our diplomats are expected to be creative, sensitive, and responsive to changes. I always say our job will not adapt to us. We are the ones that must be adaptive. Otherwise, we risk being irrelevant. And our diplomats must continuously enhance their knowledge. They must be. And again, during this pandemic, it means following the latest updates of COVID-19, although we are neither doctors nor epidemiologists. Some of my diplomats are assigned to facilitate international cooperation on the development of COVID-19 vaccine. So, I mean, my personal experience, I have my son is a medical doctor. Now I can start having discussion with him about vaccine and medicine. And this pandemic also required us to think fast and act fast, because the lives and livelihood of many Indonesians could be at stake here. In the foreign ministry, we always strive to be bold and innovative, including finding solutions to break bureaucratic impediment and escape from business as usual traps. We formed at the ministry a small team to deal with COVID-19 issues and provide me with updates on daily basis. So usually at 6 o'clock in the morning, I got the report, and about at 6:30 or 7 a.m. in the morning, I reported to the president. So every morning I reported to the president about what is going on. I mean, it's more the global perspective, of course, every morning. And on top of that small team, I have also a small team responsible on the economic recovery acceleration. And to monitor, of course, the follow-up of trade and investment plan, and as part as our support to Indonesia economic recovery. So again, there are a lot of things that we can do during this pandemic.
Okay, and it must have been a steep learning curve for everyone at the ministry. You mentioned about that your last travel was in February, and I believe if not for the pandemic, you must have had a lot of travel right now, because Indonesia now is the member of the UN Security Council and Human Rights Council, and next year we will be a member of UN ECOSOC. So it's going to be a lot of travel, but unfortunately, but with all this position, how will you use this, or Indonesia use this, to promote cooperations against COVID, international cooperation, the multilateralism now? Yeah.
All right. So let me start with my last travel. My last travel was in February, and it was to Doha and Kabul. That is for the Afghanistan issue, because you know that Indonesia is trying very hard to contribute on the peace process in Afghanistan. And actually August is very important month for Indonesia, because we hold the presidency at the UN Security Council. And the schedule was that now I should be in New York to chair the meeting in New York. Yeah. But due to the COVID, then I could not fly yet to New York. So this evening, I will chair from Jakarta the meeting on the Security Council, and I chair it virtually from Jakarta. But alhamdulillah that our diplomacy and track records have recently won us, you mentioned it, seat in the 3 very important UN organs and bodies, namely the Security Council, and then the Human Rights Council, and also the ECOSOC. Of course, we will be working tirelessly and utilizing our membership to raise our national priorities, and including, of course, addressing this pandemic. And since the very beginning of the pandemic, Indonesia has actively contributed to regional and global effort to address COVID-19 and its impact, including through the UN. And last month, after a long process, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted resolution, I think this number is 2532. The resolution, it has the number, right? 2532, that demanded immediate cessation of hostilities in all conflict situations. It's a bit overdue, actually. Just last month, then the UN Security Council adopted that, finally, unanimously adopted that resolution. Certain members of the Council initially could not come into an agreement on appropriate reference to the WHO in the resolution. You know, right, the sensitive issue of mentioning the WHO and others. And Indonesia proposal, because before we co-initiated the resolution and the UNGA, and on the UN Security Council, we proposed to use the reference of the UNGA resolution on COVID-19 that we co-initiated and was eventually accepted by all members as a middle ground solution. So we tried to bridge the differences, and finally the UN Security Council adopted that resolution. This resolution is very instrumental in supporting the UN Secretary General's call for immediate global ceasefire and humanitarian pause in conflict situation. And as I mentioned to you, this month we will hold the presidency, and the theme for this year presidency, this month presidency, is advancing sustainable peace. And one of the signature events of our presidency will be a high-level open debate on pandemics and the challenges of sustaining peace. It will explore how the Council could do better to support conflict-affected countries sustain peace during this pandemic. And now moving on the UN Human Rights Council. A few months ago, the Council President adopted a statement on human rights implication of COVID-19 pandemics, and it contains Indonesia proposal on the importance of equitable access to health products, especially diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccine. And many of you must be aware by now that this is a very important issue to Indonesia and developing countries alike. And starting from next year, Indonesia will also be a member of UN ECOSOC. We will be using ECOSOC as a platform to promote the much needed socio-economic recovery due to COVID-19. Of course, we will deal with the issue related to SDGs as well.
So yeah, at least there's a silver lining that I think we can go back to our senses, and that we have a serious problem of COVID, and now we can go back to basic like cessation of hostilities and ceasefire. I want to move on with, I don't know, you may consider this as sort of a personal questions, but COVID has affected vulnerable groups more than others. Surveys in America, for instance, this affect Black and Black communities more than other. As a woman, what is your view on COVID impacts on women or this gender group? And do you think that women can play a bigger role or more significant role in addressing this pandemic, Retno?
Well, thank you very much for asking this very important issue about women, the role of women during the pandemic. Well, the issue of women empowerment is always close in my heart. That is not because I'm a woman. Well, of course, I'm a woman, but I see the potential of women to be part of the solution. And if you observe, Taufiq, in the last couple of years, the issue of women empowerment becomes an important element in the Indonesian foreign policy. I can explain to you a lot about it, but let me focus on the pandemic. This issue has been regularly discussed in the Women Foreign Ministers meeting. So we have a club, a group of female foreign ministers. And every now and then we have the meetings and we discuss about women-related issue. And during the meetings with my colleagues, the female foreign ministers, I always underline the importance of hitting the reset button in our approach. We need to look at the issue from two different perspectives. Any intervention, any policies must always consider both women it's very difficult, vulnerabilities, sorry, and their potential. So the protection and also women as part of the solution. First, there is no question that this pandemic has disproportionately affected certain vulnerable groups, including women, you mentioned. Many do not have sustainable incomes or work in the informal sector, and they are deprived from access to social protection scheme, proper health care, and many socio-economic stimulus provided by the government during the pandemic. At the same time, isolating at home during the pandemic has reportedly heightened their vulnerabilities against domestic violence. I think it does not only happen in Indonesia, but also in many countries, the increasing number of domestic violence. So the Indonesian government is committed to prevent further discrimination against women during the pandemic. So again, the clue here, the key word is to prevent further discrimination, means protecting women. Second, this is another perspective that many tends to overlook. Women can be important part of the solution to fight COVID-19. I read the statistic the research. And it seems that women make up more than 70% of global medical workers. In Indonesia, women own more than 64% of MSMEs. Many of them diversified their business during the pandemic to produce protective gears, masks, and others. In stay-at-home situation, women also remain the primary caregivers for children and the elderly, and they are expected to help their out-of-school children to keep up with their education. Outside their houses, they can also take up the role in educating their surroundings on COVID-19 preventive measures, including the use of masks. And President Widodo last week, I think, talked about involving ibu-ibu PKK in promoting the use of masks in the society. So from what I mentioned to you, Pa Taufiq, again, when we talk about women, of course, we have to talk about the protection for them, to prevent them of being further discriminated. But on the other side, I do believe by empowering them means we involve them more as part of the solution, including in fighting against COVID-19.
And these SMEs run by women, I think, can contribute greatly to the economy. But unfortunately, yesterday we have the figures from BPS, and it's not really good that we're going to have a contraction in the economy. And I think this is happening all over the world. We have a similar situation, and I think this is a very important question for us. Is that, in your opinion, how can we accelerate the global economic recovery, and what can we contribute to this?
Well, it's very challenging. It's very challenging. The economic recovery is very challenging for every country. But let me take you first to the impacts of this pandemic on the global economy. Last month, the IMF downgraded its projection for the global economic growth in 2020 at minus 4.9%. And indeed, the world is facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, a crisis like no other. And according to World Bank's latest projection, the COVID-19 will push between 71 until 100 million people into extreme poverty. And then look at what the World Food Programme said. The WFP, World Food Programme, estimated there would be 270 million hungry people before the end of 2020. This is an 82% increase from before the pandemic. Increase 82% before the pandemics. So I think the international cooperation, again, is the key here. And let me highlight 3 issues here. First, it is important for countries to keep their market open for trade and investment. Countries must address non-tariff barriers, refrain from introducing new and unnecessary barriers that may hinder smooth movement of goods and services. And Indonesia consistently delivered these messages in the first few months of the pandemic. And then second, the travel bubble. The travel bubble may hold the key to reactivate economic and business relations between countries. And many countries have explored such arrangement as they restriction of movement and gradually reopen their border, but not at the expense of the health. Of course, health is always number one. So respecting and implementing health protocol becomes an important part of the arrangement of travel bubble. And I would like to share with you that last week, Indonesia came into agreement with the UAE to establish a safe travel corridor for business essential. That is the first for Indonesia. Just this morning, I talked also with the Singapore foreign minister, and we start discussing, that's very initial still, discussing about the green lane, green first lane for Indonesia and Singapore, but this is still very initial. So at this stage, the travel bubble should not be seen as a burden, but as a path toward the new normal and economic recovery, not at the expense of health consideration. So hopefully that's very clear. And then third, economic integration remains very important. Regional comprehensive economic partnership is one of them. And Indonesia has been underlining the importance of signing RCEP in its fourth summit in November this year. Because for Indonesia, the signing of RCEP will strengthen economic integration among its members and help resume economic activities in the region. And now we must not lose sight that this crisis is inherently a health crisis. We cannot separate our effort to promote economic recovery from our response to this pandemic. So as long as some part of the world still struggle to contain the virus, we cannot expect the global economy to fully recover. So once again, cooperation, collaboration are keys.
Okay, I think the last point was very important, Bu Retno, and I think we ran out of time. And I think if I can sum up from your presentation, I think amongst this problem, I think you sort of express optimism that we can overcome this. And thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, and we look forward for your appearance at the UN. We really want to get an update on that. And again, on behalf of the Jakarta Post and all the participants, I think we thank you. And I think we should give Bu Retno a sort of virtual round of applause. Thank you, Bu Retno.
Thank you very much. May I close by just a word? One is about the optimistic. We have to be optimistic. And then second one is united. We have to be united, because without cooperation, without unity, then that will be very difficult for us as a country and for the world to really fight the pandemic and to bounce back to economic to have the economic recovery. So once again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Bu Retno, and good luck with the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu Retno. And before Ibu leave, I'd like to invite all speakers to take pictures so that we will remember this moment together. Okay? Udah siap? So yeah. So before I will count to 3. So and then we're ready to go. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that is great. Thank you very much, Ibu Retno.
Okay, I just want to say hi to Gary, to Niels.
Hi. Okay.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Terima kasih, Ibu. Thank you very much.
Okay, Dian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. This actually the journalist in me actually still want to hear more updates from Ibu Menlu, especially in the issues that we are following very closely. And as you know, unfortunately, Ibu Retno will not be staying with us for the rest of the webinar, but don't you worry, we still have 4 distinguished speakers who will share their perspective on multilateral diplomacy amid pandemic. So we will have more fruitful discussion. Now, before we go to the panel session, we will have a breakout session where and we are going to play some of the multimedia reporting fresh from the Jakarta Post production room. Enjoy. Nggak ada suaranya.
Nih cepet ada, kalau bisa 3 bulan, kita bilang nggak bisa 3 bulan, karena kita harus melakukan dengan hati-hati dan dengan benar, ya. Karena kalau untuk uji klinis medis itu ada tata cara yang udah diatur oleh WHO, harus begini, nggak boleh dicepetin atau gimana, nanti hasilnya tidak baik. That is some of our video coming from our Jakarta Post multimedia team. If you like our videos, please check out other multimedia reports on our website, YouTube channel, and our social media platform in Twitter and Instagram. And you have seen some of our multimedia reports. Comment and tell us what are your favorite in the chat room. Now, on to the next session. We are going to have a panel discussion, yes. And we have with us today our 4 great speakers. The first will be Pak Siswo Pramono. Pak Siswo is the Foreign Ministry's Head of Research and Development. He is leading the agency that is basically the brain of the ministry, and we look forward to hear his thought on the future of diplomacy. And we have been talking a lot about multilateral values with Ibu Retno, so we are delighted to have Mr. Niels-Scott, the UN Resident Coordinator at Interim for Indonesia, and we look forward to hear his perspective about Indonesia's role in this endeavor. And we also have with us today Ambassador Gary-Quinlan. He is the Australian ambassador to Indonesia, and we know Indonesia and Australia have worked closely in many aspects in COVID-19 response, and one of those is in the upholding the multilateral values amid pandemic. So we really want to know his perspective upon this issue. And last but not least, we have Pak Philips-J-Vermonte, the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, who will also share with us his analysis about Indonesia's foreign policy. So the Jakarta Post editor Tama Salim will be moderating this great panel. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone that we will have a question and answer session after the speaker have their presentation and talks, and we encourage participants to ask any question you might have in the Q&A feature in your Zoom app, not in the chat because we might lose them. And we have seen some of the question. Don't be hesitated. Don't hesitate if you want to ask in Bahasa Indonesia. We will translate that for you. I already seen some question in the Q&A box, and we will read it for you. So I would like to hand over to Mas Tama to begin this panel session. Please, Mas Tama.
Okay, thank you, Dian. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all of our speakers today for sparing us some time from their busy schedules to discuss this most relevant of topics in the foreign policy space. We have Niels-Scott, who is currently joining us from the other side of the world in Ireland. I hope we didn't wake you up too early, Pa. And also on the line, we have Gary-Quinlan, Australia's ambassador to Indonesia, who decided a few months back to work from home, just like the rest of us. So thank you for your empathy, Pak Dubes. Unfortunately, Pak Siswo and Pak Philips will be joining us soon, but I trust that everyone is staying healthy and safe as well, and it's good to have you all here. So I want to slip in a big thank you to the Jakarta Post webinar team for making this event possible. We've been doing webinars week after week, so this would not have been possible without the support and help of the team. And lastly, I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in from around the globe, especially for those who have already sent in some questions for our panelists. We'll try to get in some answers later in the segment. We hope our discussion today will be a lively one. In fact, I'm quite certain it will be thoroughly engaging based on the facts that I've gathered from our speakers. We have Pak Siswo. Thank you for coming, Pak. Hope you've been well. And we just need to wait for Pak Philips. So before we begin, let me just frame our discussion today based on our topic of choice. It is multilateralism during a pandemic, Indonesia's perspective. So in the previous segment, we heard quite a bit from Ibu Retno-Marsudi, Foreign Minister of Indonesia, on how Indonesian diplomacy has made no secret about pushing for global cooperation on COVID-19. Ibu Retno said in the last segment that Indonesia will continue to promote solidarity and cooperation at a time when countries are seeking to become self-reliant due to the pandemic, so as to avoid a new kind of Cold War, she says. Now, as of today, the coronavirus disease has infected upwards of 18 million people worldwide and has killed more than 700,000 lives. One tally that I have just pulled up here, based on the last 2 weeks of data alone, tells us that one person dies from COVID-19 every 15 seconds on average. I don't know how true that is, but I can say it is the single biggest global health crisis of our modern day. And it is more important than ever for the international community to band together to overcome this pandemic. Fortunately, we won't be starting from scratch, because for the past 75 years, we have, nation states have worked together to set up the foundations of international cooperation and multilateral diplomacy. Pat Niels here is part of the UN, one of the institutions that we will be talking about today. But the pandemic itself has served as a sort of a wake-up call for multilateralism, as one diplomat recently asserted to me. And so with the task of working for the greater good pitted against individual national interests. The outbreak has exposed fault lines in the global supply chain and has played off global public health against economic recovery. So the task of the diplomat here has never been so dilemmatic. But as Winston Churchill once said, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. So now I'd like to turn to our speakers for their insight on this global health crisis and how Indonesia's championing of multilateralism might be a step in the right direction. Perhaps they can also offer possible solutions to what role multilateral diplomacy can play to turn the current challenges into opportunities. So our first speaker is Pak Siswo Pramono, who is in charge of the Foreign Ministry's Policy Research and Development Division. I understand Pak Siswo will elaborate on how diplomacy has changed in the post-COVID-19 world. So the floor is yours, Pak.
Thank you, Mas Tama, and hello to all the speakers of this afternoon. The topic of our talking today is on multilateralism during a pandemic. We have learned a lot from your conversation with Minister Retno this afternoon, and he has covered most of our topics today. But I will go more into the detail in a positive tone, of course. The first is on the economic diplomacy to mitigate the impact of pandemics on the in Southeast Asian region, in ASEAN region, our region. Yes, ASEAN has been hit badly by the pandemics, estimated about -2% contraction in the economy, but expected to be rebound next year or 2022 by about 6%. And just remember that ASEAN is part of the larger economics of East Asia. East Asia is likely to be the region which is going to recover first, hopefully by next year, which is then followed by European Union and much later, perhaps North America. So we see the early evidence of how the economics in Southeast Asia has been kicking so far. So looking to the logistics side, for instance, we check it from the website of marine traffic. So for instance, the port of Shanghai and the port of Singapore, in a day, in one day, 24 hours, there are more than 1,200 departures and 1,200 arrival of vessels. So this is a good sign. In Europe, let's say Rotterdam, the movement of vessels in the port is already reaching 900 to 1,000 a day. While in New Orleans, in the United States, it's still about 100. So far, for us, this will be in the domains of economic diplomacy that Ibu Retno already mentioned this afternoon, how to prepare ourselves in anticipating the recovery of the global economy in the coming years. When the pandemic hit the world, starting from China, then Western Europe, early this year, we see the tension on multilateralism for everyone is for themselves at the time. Ibu Retno already explained this this afternoon. Now we see more cooperation, which might lead to the new form of multilateralism and with a bigger role of civil society. So in Indonesia, for instance, our diplomacy is also geared towards cooperation to mitigate COVID-19 in Indonesia. We receive pledge and support from more than 17 countries: Japan, EU, United States, China, Australia, South Korea, and many others. Out of the 17 countries, we have 100 NGO from these countries. So that is, I mentioned about multilateralism with the bigger role of civil society. So civil society has been very active in combating and mitigating the impacts of COVID-19, and they cooperate one to the others. So we are going to see the new multilateralism coming. I believe so. We and as well as in the world, we have new generation of diplomats. Now, for instance, 40% of our diplomats in Pejambon are now millennials. The millennials are those who are born from 1980s to 2020. So today they are within the age of 20 years old or 40 years old. Now this is important, safe in the paradigm on how people are going to see global security, for instance. The millennial generation, in particular those in East Asia, including Indonesia, Western Europe, Oceania, and Australia, North America, they have been exposed not by open war, just like the first generation, our grandfather during the decolonization, or Cold War, just in like the second generation or third generation of diplomat, but with pandemics. Just remember, AIDS war started in 1980s when the first generation of millennial was born in 1980s. Until now, we don't have really vaccination against AIDS. And then SARS, and then MERS, and now COVID. So pandemic is the real threat for the millennials, and 40% of diplomats now are millennials. Yeah, they might have some different view with the previous generation. And this is also the generation, the millennials, that are going to lead Indonesia to the golden years of 2045, 100 years of our independence. They will, they with the other millennials all over the world are then, I hope, having new perspective on global security. Yes, we still have armed conflicts in some part of the world, but the main threat in the near future, you can see, for instance, from World Economic Forum risk assessment, are infectious diseases, pandemics, climate change, failures in the high-tech communication, cybersecurity, which is important threat for it's a very dangerous threat for global e-commerce and e-governance, etc. So this is the real threat that is the current generation is facing. And with the perspective of millennial in global politics, I believe that we are going to see the strengthening of multilateralism in the new context. Now, the next is what is the key lesson from the pandemic for us? This is the question put by Jakarta Post in the term of reference. So we need to enhance our capacity on health-related industry. Retno already mentioned this, and there are chances. One is that we need to take the opportunity from the relocation of industry from China to ASEAN region, for instance, including to Indonesia. I just joined a meeting this morning with one American company which is going to relocate to Indonesia. I will not mention the name, but we have this company is moving in. But it is not only the American companies that are going to move to ASEAN region or to Indonesia, but also Japanese, Korean, the Chinese companies are also moving. Yeah? So this is the opportunity for us to strengthen our industrialization, including on the health-related industry. Number two is to build our own capacity. Again, Ibu Retno mentioned that this morning too, this afternoon too. So for instance, on pharmaceutical industry, my unit in the foreign ministry, PADA, has done some research on pharmaceutical. So out of the 30 groups of products, about 70% are either grid or sunrise. Grid means that you have a good points or values very high on the review comparative advantage, but at the same time, you are also very competitive. So 70% are either on grid or sunrise. So we have a confidence on the synergy, I believe, between relocation that is coming now and the homegrown capacity of our industry, and particularly to be more self-reliant, resilience on health-related industry. So, Tama, I think, and this is a couple of points I would like to raise this afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Siswo. So, if I may summarize a bit, we're looking, Pak Siswo said that we are looking at a rebound in the economy by 2022, hopefully. And so we have to work on anticipating the recovery. There will be more cooperation and new forms of multilateralism and a bigger role of CSOs, new multilateralisms by millennials, which is interesting, and perhaps a fresh perspective on geopolitics when they come into the positions that are left by their seniors today. The threat of the pandemic is the biggest one for this new generation, and I think countries in general are looking to build up their self-reliance. So thank you, Pak, for those points. For our next speaker, we have Pak Niels-Scott, Resident Coordinator at Interim of the United Nations in Jakarta, although he is currently working from home as well. Pak Niels will present an overview of what is happening globally right now. So the floor is yours, Pak Niels.
Thank you so much. And I apologize for my screen disappearing from time to time, but I'm a little technologically challenged. And when I was trying to put the background on, as you could see, it wasn't entirely working. Thanks very much to the Jakarta Post for this extremely useful opportunity to discuss multilateralism within this era of COVID. a great welcome also to the 323 participants, which testifies to the success of your program webinars. Let me begin by saying very quickly, back in the beginning of this year, as Ibu Dian said at the outset, it seems like a long time ago, we were told that the epidemic had changed to a pandemic. A number of people were thinking, well, what's the difference? Well, we had a virus that was able to move around. There was a global link in the virus, which we didn't have before because it was more localized, mainly due to the movement of people. And then we were faced with a virus that was moving rapidly across the globe, and at the same time, challenges in multilateralism. So that was put it in its context in a way. It was up to us to respond, to be able to work as a global community to beat this global virus. And I very much appreciate Minister Retno's remarks this morning. I take this opportunity to appreciate right from the get-go Indonesia's commitment, very strong commitment to multilateralism and to global solidarity during this time of heightened global geopolitical tensions among the major partners, which has been exacerbated, as has been mentioned, by COVID-19, certainly in political terms. And also, multilateral diplomacy has been so heavily impacted by many countries. Having approached the COVID-19 crisis, let us be frank, in fairly nationalistic terms, prioritizing unilateralism over regionalism or international solidarity to the benefit, to the detriment rather, of losing the gains that we would have from multilateral responses to a pandemic, a cross-border, a regional, a global threat to all of humanity. But then I suppose the third aspect is that the COVID-19 pandemic has had practical limitations on what we might call traditional diplomacy, whatever that may be. It's so important for diplomats and international public civil servants at the UN, for example, to be able to meet and to greet, and to move in the corridors and to move in the conference rooms. But we have been able to adapt, thanks to technologies, to a new way of working. And Minister Retno rightly pointed out that on behalf of Indonesia, she will be chairing the Security Council later today from Jakarta, to absolutely no detriment to the discussion. And Indonesia has demonstrated time and time again that it is not a pandemic, a major global challenge which is preventing multilateralism from taking place. And I'll just go in a few minutes to some of the areas where Indonesia has been able to really come to the fore. I think the basis for all this has been Indonesia's inclusive foreign policy. And as the UN celebrates its 75th anniversary, and Indonesia does also, we're looking back, I guess, at 75 years of achievements and challenges, but also forward. And as Minister Retno pointed out, maybe asking some questions of how we can do global governance better. But what we will also be doing is to underline the very good example that Indonesia has provided in inclusive approaches to diplomacy. This has been evident in its role in the non-aligned movement, in its reputation for maintaining friendships over enemies as a strategy which is at the basis of a foreign policy. If we look at the ASEAN outlook for Indo-Pacific, this has been the intention of including major powers, including China and the US. It provides a very good example of Indonesia's commitment to inclusivity and the promotion of dialogue and cooperation. At a time, as I said earlier, and many other speakers have said, of increasing geostrategic rivalries. So that's a very good example. And the ASEAN outlook for Indo-Pacific, which was conceived and proposed by Indonesia, we should say, also from our perspective, very importantly, includes the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, as a major component for broader regional cooperation and demonstrating how this instrument, which has been adopted by every member state, can be moved from just being an advocacy tool to something which is going to be effective in dealing with the socioeconomic impact as well as the health impact of COVID, as the Minister mentioned earlier. And Indonesia, right from the get-go, from the Millennium Development Goals through to the SDGs, has been such a strong advocate of multilateralism. Within that, what basically is our roadmap for moving out of the pandemic and strengthening our resilience to future shocks. So another aspect, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention this in dealing with multilateralism, is the peace and security ticket. And Indonesia, again, has demonstrated and shown in practical terms its very strong belief in multilateral institutions, including the UN, very pleased to say, but also with a contribution to global peace and security through its peacekeeping contributions, which go back to 1948. And here I may be speaking completely out of turn, but Jakarta Post first began when? What was it? What year was Jakarta Post established?
We basically started in the early 80s, 83, 84.
When was it, sorry?
80s, the 83, 84.
83,
yeah.
Okay. So Indonesia ranks at the moment in the top 10 of global peacekeeping contributing countries, with military and police serving in multiple peacekeeping operations. And not only that, but I think we should also recognize Minister Retno's commitment to increase the quantity and the quality of female peacekeepers, not only at the national level, but also at the global level. The UN General Assembly resolution for global solidarity to fight COVID-19 was mentioned, but again, this puts Indonesia in the forefront. And this was a resolution which I'm not sure it's unusual. It struck me as possibly being unusual. It was a resolution bringing together 5 smaller nations, Ghana, Liechtenstein, very small nation, Norway, Singapore, and Switzerland. But it was an exemplary initiative of support for this type of multilateral diplomacy, which we've been considering. And the Minister was saying earlier, what's needed is flexibility, is resilience, is a new way of working. And this resolution emphasizes that. And it was, in a way, rather a significant historic development for multilateral diplomacy, because it was passed virtually, because at the time the UN headquarters was closed, and it was a virtual resolution, but it showed that where there's a will, there's a way. And we were able to see this resolution take place, with Indonesia playing a key role in calling on member states to forge a collective response to the pandemic, and saying once again, if need be, the importance of international cooperation. But also, what I would say is extremely appreciated is clear support that was rendered by Indonesia through the multilateral diplomatic channels for the World Health Organization, which unfortunately had been under some degree of criticism in some quarters at the time of pandemic, but at a time when the work of the WHO was more crucial than ever. So we have a situation where, as I was saying earlier, we have global challenges, we have global regional responses. We've heard some of them. And again, the role of ASEAN has been key, and we're grateful that ASEAN, supported by Indonesia, called on WHO Director General to brief the leaders of ASEAN, China, Japan, and Republic of Korea at the special summit on COVID-19 in April 2020. The cornerstone of Indonesia's foreign policy, which is regional cooperation through ASEAN, has come to the fore, whether it's through special summits, ministerial meetings, but also technical level meetings, such as Indonesia's health ministry's role as chair of the ASEAN Health Ministers meeting, the HMMM, which has been convened on a number of occasions. So we see a new era. We see the value of multilateralism in practice on a number of levels. We can see the impact. It's at times, I think, for all of us, quite challenging to see how we move out of this era of COVID, when we'll move out of this era of COVID. But what we do know is that if we can establish that basis for multilateral cooperation, which Indonesia has contributed to such a great extent, that solidarity, which the minister referred to, that sense of a common purpose, will probably, or I say probably, will certainly be the main tool we have in defeating this pandemic and making sure that we're resilient to future shocks of a similar nature should they occur. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Niels. So just a bit summary from me. Thank you for Pak Niels saying that the UN is appreciating Indonesia's commitment to solidarity. And we've seen that the pandemic has produced basically very nationalistic countries, but that we are adapting well because of technologies. There's a lot going for Indonesia, it seems. We have an inclusive foreign policy, and the global community will need to use inclusive approaches to diplomacy. I think taking a page out of Indonesia's kind of playbook. We have to think about this peace and security contributions, and then we have to focus on flexibility. And perhaps this is an acknowledgement of the limits of multilateral diplomacy, if we look at that resolution that you raised earlier. We also see that there's clear support for the WHO in this time of stress. So that is evidently a silver lining in all of this. We need to support the tools that we already have established. And I think we can establish this base, if we can establish this basis for multilateral cooperation through solidarity as the main tool, we can defeat this pandemic. So thank you very much, Pak. Let's go on to the next speaker. We have Ambassador Gary-Quinlan of Australia, a country we know has been quite recently active in the global fight against COVID-19 and is a close collaborator of Indonesia in this regard. Kami persilahkan waktunya, Pak Dubes. The floor is yours, sir. Okay, but Gary seems to be in a bit of a technical conundrum there, so perhaps we can move on to Pat Phillips for the time being. Or is Gary back? Pat Gary?
No, I'm not.
I think.
Right. Pak Tama, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Yes,
okay, sorry. Okay, listen, I hope everybody there can hear me. I want to say hello to you, Selamat sore to everybody, and Pak Siswo, great to see you. You look extremely good. And Pak Niels and Pak Phillips, great to see you all. Thank you for this opportunity. Look, the first thing I would say is that I agree with everything that Ibu Retno said, not just because she's Foreign Minister of Indonesia, but because she brought a very sharp focus, I think, to all the key issues that we have to deal with. And she speaks with the authority of someone and a country that's backing up that approach, multilaterally in particular, but regionally. And I think that's very important. So it was a very powerful presentation, and I thank her for it. I thought I might just say a few themes which can then maybe help generate some Q&A, some questions. First of all, obviously, we all know we're facing the biggest sort of economic crisis globally since the Great Depression, and a particularly unique one because we now face a situation where both the advanced economies of the world and the emerging economies of the world are in recession. And of course, the emerging economies, developing economies, constitute well over 60%. Oops, is it keep going? of the global economy. So we have a unique convergence here, which we haven't faced before. And that puts additional burdens on policymakers to cooperate and find ways of cooperating. The IMF, of course, have predicted a massive 9 trillion loss over the next 2 years. When we face the, keep going, the global financial crisis, which we all remember, the GFC, that showed us, and out of that, of course, we created the G20 at leaders level, and both Indonesia and Australia are G20 members, but it showed how much coordination was necessary. So the key economies, the motor economies of the world, didn't go over the precipice. We narrowly avoided that, but only because we cooperated and realized the need for that relatively early, although I was involved at the time with my own Prime Minister and his office. It was a pretty difficult time, but we learned a few things from that. The point I would make is we should have learned more because we need to have learned more. And the global financial crisis was not as extensive nor as deep in its impacts on the real economy in each of our economies as we're facing, of course, with this pandemic. Clearly, there are going to be quite a lot of shifts in how we act economically as countries and as groups of economies, you know, diversifying supply lines, building national capabilities, self-reliance. Ibu Retno clearly focused on that as one of the realities of what we're all doing, and sort of classifying particular sectors for many of us as strategic sectors. That's going to impact on how we try and structure our own economies and the nature of cooperation with other economies that we choose. So all of those kind of factors are sort of out there and in play. Clearly, the existing trends of change that were happening pre-COVID have been accelerated and accentuated by the COVID crisis. I mean, the shifts in the distribution of power across the world and the emergence of new countries and the distribution of power within countries as well. All this pressure on the norms, the institutions that we've built both nationally, regionally and globally are so much more acute. US-China relations, that's the fundamental fault line in the world strategically. We all know that. And of course, it centers in our region, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific. This is where that is playing out. the threat to multilateralism, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and then some new threats that have emerged, disinformation, which has become so powerful and potentially so disruptive, very dangerous, of course, and of course new cyber threats, not only from state-associated actors, but also from criminals taking advantage of the new cyber opportunities and so on. So you've got all of these new kind of factors that are out there in play. In relation to multilateralism, we're facing a huge challenge and a new challenge to multilateralism at the very time, pre-COVID, when multilateralism was already under the greatest threat that it's been under since it was created after the Second World War. So, and this is all because of a new era of strategic competition, and that centers, you know, in our own region. I mean, you have geostrategic shifts and changes, you know, the risk of power being exercised, even coercively. You've got all the technology disruption that all of us were dealing with every day. And you see my failure in being unable to carry the video. My gosh, when you get serious about technological change and its disruptive, you know, effects, ecology, ecological change, environmental change, fundamental new world is coming our way. And then, of course, these enormously complex economic and social challenges pre-COVID in how we manage our societies in the light of all those changes, which have been made so much more difficult. You know, I think one aspect of multilateralism, and I'm really pleased to see the optimism of Siswo about this and the new generation, but I think there's some very powerful, and I hope you're right, because I've got a lot of experience and background diplomatically in multilateralism. I was in the Security Council, of course, before you went on, and before I came to Jakarta, and many years worked on this. But one of the things that kept multilateralism working in the past was that we had some leadership in the global system, and we had the global multilateral system being reinforced by groups like when, you know, push came to shove, like the G7, the G20, other strong regional institutions, which you know, fought for norms and the implementation of norms and rules, sometimes you know, in ways in which Australia would have disagreed on some of this, the way it was done, but there was actually more or less a centre. Now that's gone, and the traditional leadership that we've come to expect has disappeared. And one of the problems for us all is there really is not an effective convening power in some of these institutions. Now, what does that mean? It means the rest of us, like Indonesia, Australia, and other middle powers, need to step up and fill that gap. We need to, it's essential. And it's in the UN itself, and it's in groups like the G20. People might argue about the G20, but you do need some people in a driving seat, as long as they're actually working with other constituencies to keep us all moving forward. So we need to reinforce all of those sort of institutions. So there's a role there for the middle powers. And as Ibu Retno said, you've got to take that leadership role, you've got to be active, and you must not lose your nerve, because we're dealing with a pretty tough world. And it means not only globally, you've got the WHO. I mean, fancy attacking the WHO, for heaven's sake. At the very moment you've got a global pandemic. We haven't done it, I can assure you of that. But you've got groups like the WTO. We must save the WTO. We need the rules, we need the norms. We need open trade and investment, as Ibu Retno has said, absolutely fundamental to prevent disruption to those supply chains. RCEP must be signed. You need the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the population programme, which is so important to vulnerable populations, and particularly women and girls. You need the World Travel and Tourism Associations, because we've got a unique circumstance where our borders are closed globally. No tourism, no travel. What are we going to do? We need, as individual economies and groups, to work on all of that, but we need the global system to be working with us on all of that as well. So that's very much a lesson that comes out of all of this. In relation to Southeast Asia, I very much hope that Pak Siswo's forecasts are correct, and we certainly expect that there will be a bounce in the economies again in maybe 12 months, whatever, 2021 into 2022, and so on, because it is absolutely so vital, obviously. But what we are facing for the next period, the short term, really is quite profound. And we all know poverty's going up, investment's gone down. How do you induce demand? Costs of healthcare have gone up in terms of what government has to spend at the very time that their revenue, their money's gone down. Budget deficits, debt are increasing. All of these things we know about. So we're stuck in a fairly bleak situation, which means what Ibu Retno said about being united and optimistic becomes even more important as the frame of mind to get us working together even more. ASEAN in the immediate region is absolutely, to my own country, central, absolutely central to how we proceed and go forward on all of this. My own Prime Minister gave a speech yesterday on some of these issues to the Aspen Institute, where he made the point, ASEAN centrality for us and also for our regional response is absolutely key to maintaining norms and everything else, but more fundamentally and operationally to get the ASEAN economic recovery plan up and running. We all need to work together as economies in our region for that, to do whatever we can to put pressure on others for the signature of RCEP this year, November. It really is important. Australia and Indonesia have a new comprehensive economic partnership that came into force on the 5th of July. Some aspects of that have run into some barriers because of the closure of borders. So we've got to work harder, and we're certainly putting a lot of effort, real substantial effort, with Australian business all the time, non-stop. I cannot tell you how many Zooms I do with CEOs and everybody else saying, for gosh sake, think of the new opportunity and the new areas of opportunity. Healthcare, the food security issues, do more, and particularly in terms of supply chains. Look, I think I probably should conclude because I'm probably sounding a bit bombastic, but let's hope we get some great questions. Supply chains, obviously, a big area where we need to work. If I could just briefly conclude by mentioning vaccines. Indonesia's leadership on that globally, very important. We're completely, my own country, agreeing with everything you're doing in that area. And we ourselves have given it a priority. We can't change everything, but with other groups of like-minded countries, including Indonesia, but other middle powers, and middle powers sometimes who are financially able to, influence things. We're working together to try and guarantee that there will be universal access and certainly equitable access. It'll have to build up as the thing is manufactured. I would just flag the fact that in terms of my own country, we've been associated with others, not just us, with a program under Gavi, which is the Global Alliance for Vaccines, which works with WHO as well, in trying to guarantee a system for access and distribution. A lot of money involved and people are making donations, and that's very important. But the Gavi board agreed last week on giving priority to particular countries under a new scheme known as the Advanced Market Commitment to guarantee those countries access to be able, in the short term, when we have a vaccine, to be able to vaccinate up to 20% of the most at-risk and important components of their own populations. Indonesia will be one of those countries, so we will have to fund ourselves, but for a certain group of countries, developing countries, emerging countries, the costs will be vastly less than they will be for other countries. And we're on the board, and we work closely with Indonesia to guarantee that you'd be a member of that. I'm not trying to say, that that's some sort of miracle, because other countries assisted as well, but it's the important activism that we have to use to get that sort of thing going. And I just thought I'd mention that because vaccines really are so important. Please, I've spoken too long, so let's finish. Although I believe I've come in under 15 minutes, first time in my life, I think. So I look forward to Pak Philips and then engaging with people through Q&A. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Dubes. That was very, very interesting stuff. Some things we've heard for the first time as well. Let me just shortly summarize, I suppose, if I can. You do have quite a few points there, but I think we can basically hone in on how we need to introduce new stakeholders, basically. These middle powers need to step up into the to kind of secure or support the existing system. I think that point about traditional leadership propping up multilateralism and that it's gone now, that is indeed why we need these middle powers to stand up. And Indonesia and Australia is already doing that, I believe, with the MICTA, so Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia. So and so there's a lot going on there, and we hope to see more of that soon. There is the need for rules and norms that is important, because that will be the defining, I think, the crux of the matter today. And I would like to, I think, come back to that later on in some of our questions. Vaccines as well. Yes, we do need to convene like-minded countries. That's still in the same kind of headspace as well as your previous point. So, and the mention on the Gavi board and the advanced market commitment, that would be something to look at for Indonesia later on. So thank you, Pak Gary. Last but not least, we have Pak Philips, Executive Director of CSIS. Today, Pak Philips, I think, will be arguing why the handling of COVID-19 has to be multilateral. Over to you, Chief.
Thank you, Pak Tama, and hello, Ambassador Quinlan, Pak Niels, Pak Siswo. It's good to see you all in this webinar. Look very healthy. Being the last speaker, this is difficult for me because seems that everything has been said, and I'd like to just highlight some of the points that probably have been made earlier by the previous speakers. I agree with Ambassador Quinlan that multilateralism has already been under pressure pre-COVID-19. As we all know, because of the rivalry between the two superpowers, the US and China. And we've seen the two superpowers, for example, kind of ignoring some of the multilateral platform. You know, their trade wars, for example, undermining the WTO as a kind of a widely agreed platform for settling the international trade complaints, to give you just one example. And you know, the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement and attacking WHO and so on and so forth. So in essence, you know, multilateralism has been put under stress even before the pandemic started. And secondly, I also agree with Ambassador Quinlan that given the circumstances, I think middle powers, that's the term that we've been using, middle power countries like Indonesia, Australia, and India and others need to step up and try to maintain this multilateral mode of cooperation, because as Pak Tama earlier mentioned, that I would like to highlight the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us actually to work together. We cannot afford one or two countries acting unilaterally because what we are facing is a planet-wide kind of challenge. And before COVID-19 as well, I think we all agree that we are facing the increase of cross-border security challenges, non-traditional ones. Ambassador Quinlan mentioned that transnational crime organizations, terrorism, and so on. And then don't forget as well that right before the COVID-19, I think the world has been busy discussing how we should deal with the planet-wide problem of environmental challenges and so on and so forth. And then, I'm sorry, I got a message from the organizer that there's problem with the video. All right.
You're back on. Thank you, Pak.
Okay, sorry. But you could hear me earlier, right? All right. So we've been facing a planet-wide problem that requires cooperation. No country can deal with environmental challenges alone, and no countries now, as we understand, that we cannot face the COVID-19 pandemic alone. It requires us to cooperate because we are facing twofold challenges. That is how we should protect the health of our populations. At the same time, we should cooperate for economic recoveries, because the EU has announced that EU now is under recession, and Indonesia, you know, a few days ago, our Bureau of Statistics already announced the bleak kind of assessment of our economies, and I believe all countries face the same thing. And that's why I think we need to make and we need to bolster cooperative efforts, you know, in strengthening the economic cooperation so that we can all recover from the consequences of this pandemic. And at the same time, I think for the short term, goals of all countries is that how we are tackling this pandemic and increasing cooperation in global health. I don't know how short is short, because you know, the uncertainty surrounding the duration and intensity of this pandemic seems that still being unknown. We've seen some new waves, second waves in some countries that have had earlier announced that it already successfully tackled the problem, but now you know, they suffered from another wave. So the uncertainty is pretty clear, and we don't know the duration and intensity. So we don't know how short is short term, but I think these two issues are of importance of all of us, you know, whether in Southeast Asia or at the global level, to cooperate together. Now, given that, I think there are at least 4 or 5 areas that we should cooperate for short term. Again, I don't know how short is short. Number one, I think major powers should help facilitate global resource pooling and technical assistance to countries with limited capacities. I know these major powers already under stress as well because of their domestic challenges as well. But you know, there are platforms for major powers as well as smaller powers to cooperate, and WHO is just one of them. So the pandemic makes it clear that you know, both rich countries, poor countries are equally challenged by this COVID-19. So that's why then we need to cooperate. The major powers and international financial institution should find ways, you know, to devise economic assistance to smaller countries which face dire economic consequences. You know, when demand is dwindling, unemployment increasing, we are on the risk of kind of a global you know, stress that would be consequential to not only one country, but too many countries. And secondly, I think national governments, including Indonesia, multilateral and regional forums and international institutions should increase cooperation to keep nationalism and protectionism at bay. I think Ambassador Quinlan already mentioned about the, the Gavi, the race to find a vaccine. I think we should try to keep this race to find a vaccine multilateral at the very least, because all countries need it. And then if we fail to prepare governments, to with a clear mind that this should be kind of a global-wide use of vaccine. If we fail to do that, we are even in a deeper problem, because then if vaccine is found and it's not distributed equally, then the problem of pandemic will not go away. And thirdly, I think because of the major issue for me right now is the cooperation, multilateral cooperation in global public health, then we need to address and discuss and evaluate the existing international framework for global health cooperation. The current pandemic shows that countries with both strong and weak health systems are almost equally vulnerable. The sources of this vulnerability can be domestic and international, and actually they are intertwined given the nature of our globalized nature, our interconnectedness, and so on. So existing international frameworks for global health cooperation should acknowledge that we are in this interconnectivity, and that's why viruses, pandemic, and other cross-border problems can be transported easily because our globalized nature. We praised globalization in the past, but now we are also facing the downside of this globalization. So any international framework for global health cooperation should address this issue accordingly. And then fifth, I think all countries needs to be helped or needs to be responsible to embed the framework of the international health regulation to their national surveillance system, because this is important. Pandemic now we know can start anywhere, in any country. So if countries fail to have this kind of national surveillance, they are actually endanger the other countries. So we have to find a mechanism, stronger mechanism, stronger global surveillance system for certain aspects of this international health regulation. So all countries has the ability to detect, respond, inform if there's any domestic health event, infectious disease breakout, and so on and so forth. Needs to be informed to the international community in a timely manner. Otherwise, we're going to have catastrophic consequences. Number 6, I think regional organization like ASEAN, maybe APEC, or any other regional organization, especially us in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, I'm speaking specifically about, need to increase our investment in infrastructure, capacity building, and human resource development in public health and health security. Because, when we talk about multilateralism, we can talk about the United Nations, a global organization, but they are sometimes too complex. And regional organizations actually are better situated to understand the national context of their member states. And therefore, they can lead the way to better and more efficient cooperation. So ASEAN needs to think about it, how to strengthen responsiveness and their relevance, because this is the problem that affect the citizens in Southeast Asia. And actually, regional organizations could also help support the implementation of existing global frameworks, such as the International Health Regulation. So within this, then ASEAN dialogue partners is important. Australia is is an example of excellent ASEAN dialogue partners that has been helping ASEAN in many fronts. And I think once again, now ASEAN, Australia can be very helpful to ASEAN. And the partnership, the dialogue partnership with the ASEAN +3, for example, that connects ASEAN with China, South Korea, and Japan are also important, because these are the 3 countries that I think will lead in the economic recovery stage of this pandemic. They've been proven to be economically strong country, and so then other countries' economy might be relying on these ASEAN +3 countries, and they have been also showing themselves as a responsive and responsible partners for ASEAN, I think. And lastly, I think again I'm focusing on this public health, because this is, I think, the core issue that we need to quickly respond, strengthen ourselves, and increase and accelerate cooperation, given the scale and the magnitude of this COVID-19. National government, regional, and international organization should cooperate, focus on the 8 core areas identified in the International Health Regulation. Coordinating policy and legislation that can be about traveling, interconnectivities, and so on. Strengthening, secondly, coordination, and then thirdly, surveillance, preparedness and readiness response, and risk communication, human resources, and of course, cooperation in the scientific aspect of this public health. And again, Australia, I think we should acknowledge the help from Australia in supporting the various think tanks in Indonesia, strengthening the capacity, knowledge accumulation, and so on. And now probably also this is the time to increase cooperation among the best scientists of countries in Southeast Asia, and with that dialogue partner, including Australia. So we need to enhance cooperation in this area. We need to sufficiently invest and sensing collaboration, with all these aspects of 8 core areas identified by the International Health Regulation. Pak Tama, I think I should stop there. That's what I can contribute to the discussion today.
Thank you, Pak Philips. Unfortunately, we lost your video feed from earlier, but now you're back. So I guess that, well, we can continue. Anyways.
All right.
Anyway, so we've heard a bit from everyone, and so they're all very interesting points. I'll just quickly summarize what Pak Philips just said. So he really zoned in on this dichotomy between public health and economic recovery. It is an important one for the stakeholders, the governments to figure out and strike a balance. And so that's something that I think every country needs to look at. We have to look at major powers still in the way of the north-south approach to cooperation, I suppose, where the more able countries have to kind of extend a helping hand to the lesser, smaller countries, I suppose. And this is because both sides are actually equally in dire straits, something that Gary also mentioned earlier as well. And I think that it is important as well in order to make this happen that Pak Philips said that governments need to keep nationalism and protectionism at bay. Very important. On the topic of vaccines, yes, it must be developed multilaterally or else the pandemic won't go away. He has made several points on that, which are very valid. And I think the fact that multilateral cooperation in global health specifically must be strengthened. We must, and that it must acknowledge the domestic and the global are basically intertwined. Then perhaps we can find new solutions to that. Last but not least, I think there are things about regional organizations like ASEAN stepping up to increase investments in public health and health security. And we have seen this actually pretty much this year. ASEAN has been quite active on this front. So it's good to see that this kind of thinking is we are in the right direction, at least. Last but not least, governments need to focus on the IHR recommendation. So that is something that we can already do now. And so thank you for those points, Chief. Now that we've heard from everyone, I'd like to delve into a bit more deeper into some of the things that were raised. I think one question from me for everyone today is has to do with one of the things that hasn't propped up, I think, which is the problem of scale. It has come up in parts in our speakers' points, but we have to say that there is a problem of scale with the pandemic. One, I think, estimate from scientists say that in order for a country to be safe from this virus right now, if we want to look at herd immunity as one of the solutions, then some 70% of the population of any given country has to be covered by the vaccine. And this can quickly add up if we talk about procuring, whether doses, whether, all these interconnectivities, the logistics, it can really add up really quickly. So I would like to ask everyone here if this is something that diplomacy can address effectively at the moment. Would anyone like to try and take a jab at this? It was a mouthful, but basically diplomacy. We're talking about diplomacy and whether it is effective in order to, bring this, bring something like the address the problem of scale, basically. Anyone?
Yeah, Tama.
Yep.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of things that we need to address here. The first one is, yes, it's a matter of a scale, yeah. But we also remember that during the Cold War in 1970s, yeah, Russia and United States are working together on the vaccine at the times. Yeah, I think America provide like 50 million vaccine, and Russia or Soviet Union is about 25. It's not happening today between the two. Yeah, but at the same time, every pandemic has their own character, which is very different. Remember that we still in the status of 8 pandemics now because we don't have vaccine for AIDS for the last 40 years. But we managed to walk our life by a new normal in the context of AIDS, and then must safe sex and stuff like that. Now we also have there is no promise that vaccine can be materialized or produced in the near future. Just like Philip mentioned, the near is very relative here. But again, actually, we can design the new normal, safe life, yeah, and how things can be done. And this more on the epidemiology, on the how to adjust our cultures on the new situation and so on, while waiting for the vaccine and other medicine to be found. Yeah. So I think we are moving to that direction, and the role of the diplomacy, I think, is quite clear here. If we not already mentioned, and how to push on more cooperation on back to the multilateralisms, and then support agreed at the multilateral levels and implement it at bilateral levels or minilateralisms. But we need to have one word and one vision already at multilateralism, how the COVID-19 must be dealt with together.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, if I may, I agree with Pak Siswo that even during the days of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and the United States, they talk to each other. They sit down They talk about how to reduce the nuclear arsenals, and then they were able to find an agreement on that. So it's a matter of survival of the two superpowers at the time. Now it's a matter of survival of the people. So I think being a superpower, you have to act responsibly. But you know, I'm not going into the internal dynamics of the United States, but currently I think the US is in a very unique situation. But we do hope that once the election passed in the US, whoever won the election, they would come back to their senses, and then they would start to think about how to really address this problem. And secondly, I think what's interesting about this, for example, the race to find a vaccine, it involves almost all stakeholders, not only states. So it involves big foundations, non-governmental organizations, and so on. That means I think there are understanding that this should not be contained in the domain of sovereign and short-sighted sovereign perspective of a country. Because as I made the point earlier, it doesn't make sense if your country is safe because of the vaccine, while the other in your surrounding, borders are not safe from the, from the pandemic. And by the way, this is going to be not the last pandemic that we have. I think there will be more coming. Hope not. But we should not be surprised if there are more, because if we look at the pace of this kind of a pandemic or diseases, the time is getting shorter and shorter. From the SARS, from Pak Siswo mentioned about AIDS, and then Ebola, SARS, and now we have MERS, and now we have COVID-19. It's the time in between is getting shorter and shorter. So because of the globalized nature, and that's why I think the scale, vaccine needs to be found. I agree, but aside from that, if vaccine is not to be found, in the near distant future, I think there are things that countries could do. I think in the context of Indonesia, we need to do more, and many other countries, we need to do more in separating the healthy people from those who are affected by COVID-19 by doing more tests, more tracing, and more isolation. That's, I think, the only way to go. As long as vaccine is not found, all countries need to do that very responsibly and very quickly.
Yes, Pak Tama, it's Gary. Look, I agree particularly, Pak Phillips, with that last comment that all of us, in preserving our own countries and positioning ourselves for the new normal or whatever, as we re-engage with bigger economic and social or public life again, which we need to do, have to really be stringent about what is currently available, and that is public restrictions, public mitigations, personal behavior, as you say, social distancing, better testing, better contact tracing. This is a universal thing. And of course, isolation of people who've been identified. To be safe, Pak Tama, you mentioned, the idea of herd immunity and everything. Well, we hope to get a vaccine. We just don't know whether we will get one or not. But there's a lot of focus going on as well. All this incredible effort, the fastest in history in terms of health development, for looking for vaccines at the moment, but also treatments, because we may not get a vaccine. So there's a lot of focus that's needed on what kind of treatments can be introduced. That's how HIV has been handled, because there's no way of inoculating against HIV, but there are more and more and more sophisticated treatments, of course, over the last 20 years. I mean, each country is obviously going to make its own assessments and decisions about its national policies and what scale is required, which will reflect the extent of transmission and infection, and the decision governments make about the balance that Philips mentioned about economic recovery and public health. I mean, the amount of effort that would be required and the really quite brutal decision that might be required if you go for herd immunity as the basis of your policy is really not something that's, I don't think, a viable option for governments. In terms of a vaccine, of course, once we have a vaccine, then clearly, well, that's the first achievement. It's then going to be scaled up as quickly as possible anyway. And manufacturers are already putting in place, which is good to hear, although we can't be like Pollyanna on this, you know, early stages, but putting in place some manufacturers, the ability to scale up manufacture very quickly. And a couple are even prepared once you get to the second stage of trialing a vaccine, you go through 3 stages normally, that they'll be prepared to put their money there and say, okay, we will now prepare the manufacture for the distribution of this very, very quickly, assuming that the stage 3 of testing would also work. But in the first instance, I've got to say, just coming back to the points I think we've all agreed with, diplomacy's really got to make sure that we're ensuring universal and equitable access once we get to that point. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, very good indeed. Yeah, those are very valid points. So I wanted to kind of ask one more question, I think, for everyone, if there's no one else who wants to add on to that, about that need for bringing in these new stakeholders, like the CSOs, this new kind of thinking, the middle powers, perhaps. Like, so we decided that we need to link up more. But how can we best include these stakeholders in the existing system? Because a big critique against multilateralism forever now is that it tends to be sort of an ivory tower and is far from the very stakeholders that we need to work with. So how can we prepare the international rules-based system so that the generation of the next generation of diplomats, of international civil servants, CSOs can be well prepared for the future? Anyone care to take a gander there? They're very big questions. I have to apologize beforehand, but I hope you have a competent panel.
This is the fun if we are having discussion with the journalist as a moderator. Posting difficult question. I think certainly CSO needs to be included in the discussions about how a country should deal with the pandemic, because you know, I can only speak about Indonesia, but I suspect this is also the problem faced by many other, especially developing countries. You know, all this new normal thing, the call from the government for the people to follow the instruction, to follow the protocols, and so on, seems to be falling into deaf, right? Because you know, people seems to forget once they are in a large group setting, and then everything collapses. And that's how I think then culture matters. And then the government, could not reach the people as efficient as civil society organization. In Indonesia, for example, you have the, various informal leaders, various religious institutions that can actually help persuading people, and the government needs to, to engage them and to help the government with persuasion to the people to follow this. And secondly, when we are talking about civil society organization, non-governmental organization, we are talking about, research institute, academics, and so on, that might also be able to help the government. So this is a time when all governments needs to have a bigger ear, you know, in incorporating voices and advices from various groups within the society, so that people feels the ownership that this is also our responsibility, not only the government. And thirdly, also not to mention, when we're talking about civil society, as if private institution, private companies are not part of this, which actually they are indeed part of this. You know, there are cases where, you know, private companies quickly help the government, shifting their mode of production, for example. In the early, you know, months of this COVID-19, they switch their production, they produce masks and so on and so forth. And then the, you know, the government needs to mobilize and coordinate all these you know, civil society, non-governmental efforts, so that country can be more resilient. And we are hoping that out of this pandemic, I think we will have a more friendly tone, you know, from the government side towards the civil society side, that the existence of the two are actually not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, Tama, if I may, we are providing this kind of forum in Bali Democracy Forum, the coming one, because the theme will be on democracy and then new normals, and we also discussed COVID-19, and there will be 4 pillars, yeah, of the conversation in coming Bali Democracy Forum. Is the government one, and then there's youth, and then civil society and media, and also business. So this is also the opportunity that everyone have a forum to talk on how the best way to handle this COVID-19 together. Yeah, not only government, but also the youth, civil society, media, and business. And we are going to do so on the 3rd of December coming. Yeah.
Very good. That's one more, I think, thing to you know, like wait for, and we certainly would like to see what happens at the Bali Democracy Forum. Anyone else care to?
Oh,
yeah?
Sorry, Tama, is there someone else? I don't want to jump in.
Please.
Look, I think if we look at WHO, I think that's a good example. It needs some reform. It needs stronger, you know, sort of almost independence within parameters established by member states, but it needs to be stronger. We all know that, and so on. But the way it works, I think, is a good template for broadening the stakeholder engagement across the multilateral system.
Right.
It has a global role in norms, regulations. It has a convening role, which is so fundamental. And then it has an operational role. Pre-COVID figure this is, that the WHO is still responsible for 40% of immunization of kids across the world, 40%. Now, of course, its operations with its own technical experts and representatives and practitioners, but also it does these kind of programs in consultation with other bodies who are non-governmental bodies or other governmental agencies. So it can mobilize other governmental agencies across the world as well. But when it comes to critical issues like research, it cooperates with other agencies in mobilizing the research effort that's needed. And that's, you know, demonstrated as so essential these days. So it demonstrates scientific expertise, technical expertise is needed. It can be mobilized through the central, you know, body like the WHO. The innovation that's needed and the speed that's needed can often be private sector engagement or the non-government bodies, but it all comes together, I think, as potentially a very powerful mix. And we all know that this threat, of course, is unique because it's reaching directly down into each community in each of our countries. And the response has to be, well, people, individual people and communities. And they can be so powerful in organizing the response at that level. You've only got to look at the resilience of the community response led by different communities across the archipelago in Indonesia. That has been a really important part of Indonesia's response on all of this. And for the fourth largest country in the world, it's essential, but it's been an important part, you know, and I think it's an example of what can be done. And of course, a powerful tool for governments to get messaging down to community level. So, yeah.
Very good point. I'd actually like to invite Pak Niels into this conversation. Just one more bit. Perhaps you have an idea of how one could go about leveraging the UN and its agencies to respond better to the pandemic after what we've gathered from all our speakers today.
Yes, I was going to intervene earlier, but I'm at a disadvantage because every time I'm about to intervene, people do it much better than I would and much more eloquent. You were mentioning earlier the supply of vaccines, and obviously that's an extremely valid point, but then it was also mentioned it's not just about supply, it's about distribution of vaccines. And Foreign Minister Retno recently said that it emphasized the importance of international cooperation in COVID-19 response through a, quote, fair, transparent and inclusive mechanism to allocate supplies, particularly to the most vulnerable groups. Absolutely, and I retain those last, the final words, which was particularly to vulnerable groups. And I think this is why it's so important, just to come back to the previous discussion, that we are able, we have an ear to the ground and we are able to understand the vulnerabilities arising through the impact of COVID, to make sure that there's equity and a response which is geared to helping those who run the risk of being left behind. And the other aspect I think worth mentioning is that, yeah, it's about COVID, but it's also about the non-COVID aspect of health assistance. And Ambassador Quinlan mentioned Gavi. Gavi have had this fundamental role, and thanks to Australia for the support that you render to Gavi, have this fundamental role, have had for decades in ensuring immunization. And it's important that we don't have a second challenge coming behind COVID, which would be the absence of immunization in other areas for children, which would lead to fairly devastating effects. On the second question of the role. The UN, one thing I would say is that it's been mentioned on a number of occasions that, and again, where I'm quoting the foreign minister fairly extensively, but I found her presentation so impressive. It was mentioned earlier that there would need to be some degree of discussion of the of international governments to make sure that it remains fit for purpose. And so it's, it's so useful now that we're looking at UN at 75 to perhaps take a little look at that. Certainly there's areas for development within the UN system, but I would emphasize, I think, and COVID has shown us this so clearly, is that we do need cooperation and we need a collective approach to this discussion. And this is something I think we've today in the discussion, if the one point I think has been rendered so clearly. I mean, there's been a number of extremely important points on detail, but the one point is that we can't fail on the multilateral approach at this point. We've got to have a collective approach to learning the lessons of what hasn't worked terribly well, perhaps, in our approach, and how we can do better, And that includes not only the health aspect, but also the socioeconomic aspect, because I think we need to we need to look at ways of strengthening the economy, strengthening the social assistance programs, strengthening the health system, strengthening the education system, so that we recover stronger. I'm not sure if that addressed your second question, but I'm prepared to give way at this point, and perhaps others would like to speak.
Well, there's definitely a lot to unpack here, and I do agree that with you, Pak Niels, that it's basically comes down to our alignment, the alignment of our values with the vulnerable groups, which is important to keep in mind, so that we have equitable access to the vaccines that we are producing and all that. So that's a very general conclusion. So thank you very much again for our speakers. That is not the end of this session, because we have questions from the audience, unfortunately for you people. So I would like to open the floor to Dian, obviously, who has been tightly curating the list of questions, and she will be asking on behalf of the audience. Take it away, Dian.
Yeah, so we have a very eager audience today, and we have received more than 50 questions so far, not counting the questions posted in the chat box. So dozens of questions. So we are here trying to be as accommodating as possible, and I would like to group all of these questions into several categories, and we can open the floor for the panelists to give the responses. Now, first of all, I am grouping some of the questions in the multilateral situation and the great power relations. First is from the Reinhard Matondang. He was asking, is it fair to say that today's multilateralism is still asymmetric in a way that our global system set up to benefit certain states? Given today's backlash to it, isn't it a good opportunity to rewrite this asymmetry, and how would Indonesia concretely play its role in balancing today's multilateralism? Now, to elaborate more on this, there is another question from Fajar Nugraha. He was pointing out that the US seems very stubborn with their hostile act toward WHO. Can we say this is a form of setback in multilateralism, especially when the world unity needed to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic? Does the WHO can survive without contribution from the US? Last, in this category, I would raise the question from Muhammad Iqbal Hafizon from Universitas Pajajaran. He was asking, what can Indonesia do to push the agenda of being a peace facilitator in facing the strategic rivalry between the US, also the Quads, and China in the Indo-Pacific region, with the South China Sea as the one hotspot? So at the same time, we're also facing a global health crisis at the same time. This can be addressed to Pak Siswo and Pak Philips, but I think both Pak Niels and Pak Gary have their can also add their perspective upon these issues. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Dian, perhaps I'll pick up the question on the South China Sea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are three levels of things in the South China Sea, with or without COVID. Yeah, the first one is the level of rivalries between big powers. This is the one that people also ask question and address. So on this matter, on the rivalries between big powers, power projection in the South China Sea, I think the ASEAN position is quite clear. We have shown on peace, freedom, and neutrality, in which Ibu Retno already explained this afternoon, and then Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which all big powers also are parties to it, and also ASEAN, Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone. I mean, this is the pillar of ASEAN to try to maintain. The ASEAN is not going, or Indonesia in this matter is not going to take side, but we would like to cooperate with the two big powers and all of the big powers actually. Now, in the second level, we have an overlapping jurisdiction in the South China Sea between claimants. In this part, Indonesia is not a claimant. So I think on the overlapping jurisdiction, claimants are going to solve their problem through political or legal resolutions, and it's up to them. And Indonesia can so far act as the honest brokers. And the third level is actually a problem of intrusions on the maritime belt, but it is not part of the overlapping jurisdiction. And again, this will be, in our position, will be subject to UNCLOS. Thing must be solved based on a United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. So I think this is the situation in the South China Sea. But just don't forget, yeah, we compare. Again, we did study on that. We compare how many people and how many companies every year investing in the rim of the South China Sea. The number is not decreasing, the number is increasing. And even now we have more and more company coming, relocation from China, and even China also relocate to in the rim of South China Sea. So there is a big prospect that in the future, with the better management of the South China Sea, it become one of the production base of the global market. So we need to put things in the positive tone like that. Thank you.
Tama, sorry, have I jumped in ahead of someone else? I apologize, because just a couple of quick points on the South China Sea. I mean, obviously, it shows what we're experiencing, the importance of norms, rules. It shows that we must speak out to try and protect those norms. And really fundamentally, it shows the importance of individual countries and groups and ASEAN and countries like my own being resilient and magnifying each of our influence in helping to shape a region which can be resilient for us. It magnifies our voice if we're resilient and forthcoming about protection of the rules. Look, on whether the multilateral system is still asymmetric, look, the ideals and the objectives, no, I genuinely believe that, because they are what we would say really is universal and do reflect, and a great deal of the programming, specific programming across the whole UN system, I'm talking about the UN system now, does reflect more country interest and so on in terms of economic and social development. But there are substantial parts of the system that are asymmetric. The UN Security Council. Now, I was our representative on Security Council 2013-14, and I must say the current, it does need reform. We know that. So we really have to have a focus on reforming the Security Council in terms of its membership to reflect contemporary realities. You don't want too big a body, but it needs to be bigger and more reflective of reality in the world. And we need to start, frankly, chipping away at the veto power. Australia was the strongest opponent of the veto power in 1945, but we were told to shut up in the negotiations about all of that. So, and we maintain our opposition to the veto. The French have an initiative to start modulating, and they have a veto power, the use of the veto power in the Council in circumstances where there are humanitarian crises. That would be a good step. We should all agree that, and we should bring about that change. The other pocket where there is still asymmetry is in the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. The quotas, the subscribed quotas, and the voting influence in those bodies is still in need of reform. It's not as equitable as it needs to be. And G20 members like Australia and Indonesia have been in favour, of course, of reforming that for some time. We've done a couple of papers on it over the last 10 years and so on. We've had a little bit of success, but nowhere near as much success in making those better bodies by being more reflective, including proper recognition of the weighting of China, of course, in these kind of bodies. So that's the comment I would make about that.
All right. If I may also respond on the question of the asymmetric nature of multilateralism. I agree with Ambassador Quinlan that you know, in some aspect, of course, there will be asymmetry, but I think to think about multilateralism as something, as a platform where all countries have, you know, same level of voices, I think it can be naive as well, because I think what we mean by multilateralism is that there is an agreed norms, rules of the games that agreed upon by the countries involved, and the way we achieve the way we achieve that agreed norms and rules of the game will be, I think, influenced by the different capabilities of the countries. But once we arrive at certain agreed norms and rules, that is multilateralism. Secondly, on the question of South China Sea and so on, Pak Siswo from our foreign ministry already speak out about Indonesia's position on that particular issue. But if I may add, this is purely a perspective from somebody from think tank from outside the government, that I think Indonesia's DNA has always been in Southeast Asia, has always been to transform conflicts into cooperation. We've done that in the past, you know, in various conflicts in Southeast Asia, you know, in Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. And now I think we should do that one more time, transforming the conflict areas in South China Sea into some kind of a cooperation. Because I think with multiple claimants, solutions to the South China Sea problem will not be achieved very soon. If we learn from other part of the world that has similar kind of situation, the Arctic, for example, the Arctic Sea, they have been able there to transform, you know, conflict areas into some sort of cooperation. They do have problems, but it's been years and years and years in the Arctic that they can actually arrive at some kind of agreement among the claimants, the Russians, some of the Scandinavian countries, including the United States. They were able to achieve that kind of you know, cooperations circumstances in the Arctic. So, but it requires one thing that is not there right now, that it requires countries involved not to be too assertive in their claims. And then then the role of Indonesia through ASEAN, that Pak Siswo, I think our friends in Kemlu has been busy trying to get China and the other claimants from Southeast Asia to sit on the table on an agreed kind of text for us to arrive at some kind of a code of conduct in South China Sea. Hopefully this effort will continue. Then you know, Indonesia continues to play the role of transforming conflict area into cooperation area.
If I may come in. Thank you. Just on the asymmetry discussion, this could be the subject of a doctoral thesis. I won't extemporize too much. Absolutely right. I mean, there's the ideal versus the reality. You know, we're a long way from one country, one vote. And I might mention that the fact that the Security Council has not issued any formal statement on the COVID-19 situation yet is again a reflection of some of the challenges the Council faces. And some of the geopolitical divisions which continue to make its work more difficult. But let's look on a positive note. I mean, the thing about the UN's, I'll speak about the UN since that's position I'm in. There are huge amounts, as you all know, possibly to your expense, huge amounts of pre-main, post-negotiations that take place within the UN right across the world. For any conference, there's a certain amount of discussion. I think that goes some way towards decreasing asymmetricality, if that's a word. it isn't just about the Security Council. Obviously, the Security Council is a fairly major part of the exercise. The other thing I think which is important, and this is where I come back to Indonesia on this one. I think sometimes there's in discussions a perception amongst parties of some type of balance of power. The weak, the poor, the rich, whichever. And I think it's really important for in these discussions for third parties or mediators to intervene and try to decrease the polarization in these discussions, but also to stand up for the less influential people within discussions. And I think Indonesia does this very well. And the quote from the foreign minister earlier about making sure that the most vulnerable, and it comes back again to the distribution of vaccines in COVID, the most vulnerable are taken into account in the way these supplies will be distributed is again a very effective means. I could give you many quotes. I won't take too much time, but I could give many quotes of where Indonesia has come in a spirit of multilateralism and regionalism to actually detract from the asymmetricality of the discussions and actually introduce to use a rather daring word, to introduce some degree of democracy within discussion and to make sure that the smaller players are also represented. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we still have one more. We still have time for one more question. There is a group of questions wondering about the relations between Indonesia and Australia. There is Pinkan Audrin who addressed her question to Pak Gary and Pak Siswo. How the Australia and Indonesia accelerate the benefit of Indonesia-Australia CEPA in response to the current economic disruptions? Is there any adjustment being made for particular area of cooperation after the agreement entered into force last month? And there are a lot of questions about how the cooperation will tackle the pandemic. There's also people who are wondering to Mr. Gary-Quinlan, when will Australia open border for traveler, and will the work holiday visa is applicable for Indonesian citizens this year? There's also people who are concerned that the travel restriction have prevented people who are going to Australia or people who are going to leave Australia cannot travel. So maybe you can address those questions too. Thank you.
Pak Siswo, do you want me to quickly say, look, in relation to the second question on borders, look, we don't know, but at the moment it's extremely unlikely that Australia, the current closure of the borders will be lifted anytime soon. And I mean, maybe not until much later this year. We don't know. Australia is experiencing at the moment not a second wave of infection, but a surge. We've had a great deal of success in suppressing transmission of the virus. Now, we didn't think we defeated it because we knew that we hadn't, and that there was still a possibility of it surging again. In the last few weeks, it has surged, particularly in the state of Victoria, Melbourne, state of Victoria. And that surge is now, of course, infecting other parts of the country as well. By comparison with a lot of other countries, the figures are still very low, but this thing is so contagious and acts so quickly that it could, become a bigger and bigger risk. So the government is, all governments across Australia, the national government in each of the states, we now have a national cabinet which meets every week and so on to decide these things, is going to maintain closure for quite some time. Now, what that means for the worker holiday visas, which under IHEPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, automatically have gone from 1,000 to 4,400 a year, and then we'll go a bit higher. That does mean that's had to be paused. And that's very unfortunate, but it reflects the reality of, of what's happening with the transmission of the virus. The government is focused at the moment, our government, on trying to look at how we can find a way to allow international students, however, globally, to get back into the country. A lot of students are already here, but those who are going to begin new courses. So that's a big focus at the moment, and the government's thinking of introducing some pilot schemes to see how they work on that. In relation to IHEPA, look, one of the big advantages for Indonesia, I mean, both countries benefit from this agreement, but obviously one of the short-term benefits that we had been very committed to and that Indonesia obviously wanted was the skills package, which is work-holiday arrangements, but the ability of tertiary educated young Indonesians to come down and spend up to a year or more in Australian businesses to get some experience. And then those who don't have university education to come down under another scheme of a skills exchange package going into Australian businesses. And it really is, it's sad that that's all on pause for the moment. So I'm not sure what we can do about that until the borders, of course, reopen. We certainly, as a government, myself, my team in Jakarta and here in Australia, are working extremely hard with Australian business. I spend, so much of each week now talking via Zoom and everything else to CEOs and other people in Australian business to talk about Indonesia, to brief them and talk about opportunity, 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 not risk, but opportunity. And we're being very, we're being very targeted about that, taking sectors of business which we think are very prospective, so that people in business in Australia don't miss the opportunity. And as I said earlier on, the new business opportunities that they may not have thought about, particularly in healthcare and all those associated areas, and new areas of agribusiness and research into new agribusiness technology and the development of better supply chains between the two of us in those areas. But the reality is it's obviously going to be a bit slower than we'd wanted because of we're all held hostage by the virus.
Yeah, Dian, I just would like to add a bit more. On the SEPA, I think we are now entering the early harvest. And yes, the last month we have a very intensive discussion with Australian partners. This is our industry and Australian industry. We also have Indonesian diaspora in Australia, which are actually quite successful business persons and business community. So we intensify, and tomorrow I think we are going to have one again discussion with the Australian side, people to people, on how the two countries can have the maximum benefit from the early harvest and the SEPA. And we are talking more focused now, let's say, on the fertilizer industry. It seems like very much complementary for the two, that even there is a possibility for outbound investment for Indonesia abroad on the fertilizer industry, for instance. And then on the cattle, we still a net importer of meat, and then this has been in the agenda of the discussion. Education, this is one thing. So yes, a lot of effort now and contact has been made by the two communities, not necessarily government to government. We facilitate the discussion among our diaspora in Australia, our businessmen in Indonesia, and also Australian business. But actually important is we need also realize that differences is still there between Indonesia and Australia as far as culture is concerned, for instance. So actually the new Colombo plan is another hope that Australia now is time after the pandemic, of course, to send more young people to study in Indonesia, not necessarily Indonesia study to Australia, but it's also time for Australian youth to learn more about Asia, because the future of the world, the ASEAN century is real, and Australia is part of this ASEAN centuries. And trust is also very important. And there's a good news, of course, that if we look at the orientation of young people in Indonesia who take higher education, in the past, I think the previous generation is normally Europe or North America, but now it's more and more from Asia and Oceania. Yeah. So again, we did some study for our young diplomat who takes higher education. Again, we are talking about 60%, 65%. Yeah, take the master degree or PhD from Asia and Oceania. It's quite different with previous one is mostly Western Europe or North America. So I think with this 3 points, we believe that relation between Australia and Indonesia will be much stronger in the future. And this is very strategic one. Different nature, of course. Indonesia is a country with a very big market. The market in Australia, of course, if we are talking, it's not as big as Indonesia. But this is another complementarity in nature, I think. Because Australia, you know, in 1930 will be among the highest per capita income. Yeah, even though the population is small, but per capita income is really very high. Yeah, so this is also another complementarity that we anticipate. We need to anticipate from now.
Okay.
I think we are now 3 minutes before we are supposed to end our webinar right now. So I am very sorry that we cannot accommodate all 55 questions that we have received, but I think we already have a very fruitful and extensive discussion. And yeah, so I thank you for everyone participating. Thank you for all the attendees. And we will have, I would like to inform you that we will have another webinar coming up next week. The topic this time will be educating the nation. And Education Minister Nadiem Makarim will be speaking with us. So it's very exciting. So make sure you register and stay tuned in our website for more information. So if you want to get more access and insightful stories with the Jakarta Post, don't forget to subscribe on the jakartapost.com/packages. Don't forget to follow our social media, the Jakarta Post images, and on Instagram and Jakpost on Twitter. Once again, thank you very much. This is a very fruitful discussion. Have a great day and stay safe and stay well.